Poštovani gledalci, lagano se približavamo presudi protiv Ratka Mladića u žalbenom postupku. Haški tribunal završava svoj rad i privodi kraju posljednje procese koje ima pred sobom da odradi, a ostali su još slučaj Mladić i slučaj Simatović i Stanišić. Jedan od onih koji su formirali Haški tribunal i jedan od onih koji su bili začetnici borbe za pravdu na prostoru Zapadnog Balkana je ambasador David Scheffer, prvi američki ambasador za ratne zločine, ali jedan od ljudi koji je uz Madeleine Albright, Richarda Holbrooka i Billa Clintona radio na dostizanju pravde na prostoru Zapadnog Balkana. Međutim, to nije bio njegov posljednji angažman kada je u pitanju Bosna i Hercegovina. Profesor Scheffer nam se pridružuje iz Santa Fea. Professor, welcome to program N1.
Thank you very much, Esmir. It's a pleasure to be with you and your Bosnian audience.
You wrote a several years ago article under title "The Least Wanted, Most Wanted Man." That was in 2011 when you spoke about Ratku Mladić. And I will quote you here because you wrote a very interesting sentence here. You said, "Mladić may not have been an international villain of Osama bin Laden stature, but during the 4 years in the early 1990s, he unleashed far more killing and destruction than the Al-Qaeda mastermind managed in almost 2 decades of terrorism." That, as you said, the least wanted, most wanted man will face his final verdict on Tuesday. How do you see the process against Ratku Mladić, and what do you expect from the final judgment from the ICTY in his case?
Well, Esmir, the arc of international criminal justice is very, very long, and that can be very frustrating. But when we started building tribunals, such as the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal in the early 1990s, one of the points we made was that this will probably not be a very quick process, that it will take many years in order to investigate, indict, capture, and finally prosecute and reach judgment on masterminds of atrocity crimes, which are genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Ratku Mladić is the prime example of that premise, because it took a long time to find him and to finally, in May of 2011, capture him in northern Serbia, and then bring him to The Hague within a number of days, and then the process began. And it's a process that has been delayed occasionally because of Mr. Mladić's own health and the surgery that he had to undertake a number of years ago. And also the COVID situation has delayed the final result in The Hague, as well as challenges by Mr. Mladić to certain judges sitting on the bench. And by the way, his challenge was successful, and 3 judges were replaced on the bench. And I think that's a demonstration in part of the due process that he has been afforded before the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal. His trial and his first conviction before the trial chamber, and now what we will hear on June 8th is the appeals judgment. So this is the end of the road. It doesn't go any further. He's sentenced to life out of the trial chamber, and we'll have to see what the appeals chamber has to say about that. Everyone should be conscious of the fact that the appeals chamber of any of these international criminal tribunals from, built during the 1990s and thereafter can often surprise you and take actions that reverse the trial chamber on certain counts, or in fact strengthen the conviction against, in this case, Ratku Mladić. And I do want to get to that in terms of the charge of genocide when you wish to, Esmir.
Before we get to that, you just mentioned the three judges who were replaced on the appeal chamber. And I just spoke days ago with Julian Borger of The Guardian, who's also author of the Butcher's Trail book. And he unearthed the opinions of the presiding judge in appeal chamber. She was a member of the Ptolemyer chamber, where she wrote very flattering opinions about Mr. Mladić, including that infamous meeting at the Fontana Hotel, where she said that she hasn't seen anything what would show his negative intent toward the attendees. And she says that he provided the food and drinks and cigarettes to them. And Julian Borges says that he's a bit worried when it comes to that situation with presiding judge. Should we be worried if we see such a judge sitting on this chamber, including those opinions on genocide and genocide one in case of Mr. Mladić?
Well, let's wait for the judgment on that, because if there is a concern, I would expect at least one of the judges in a concurring opinion or a dissenting opinion to raise that issue if it's an issue that really needs to be brought to bear. I highly respect Julian Borger, and in fact, I know his book extremely well, and so I respect his opinion on this. And all I can say is he knows the facts better than I do with respect to that particular judge. And let's see on June 8th whether or not that issue is even addressed by any of the judges.
We know that there was a problem in a previous situation with genocide one, which is genocide for municipalities, and both Karadžić and Mladić were convicted for genocide two, which was Srebrenica. Sir Jeffrey Nice told me that it would be of the huge significance if we see the change when it comes to the date of genocide to be moved forward in early 90s before the Srebrenica. Do you think that that could be possible now on the appeal, and what impact that could have on a final decision?
Yes, and everyone should listen to Jeffrey Nice, a highly respected barrister in the United Kingdom who knows these issues very well. I join him in that view completely. And let me explain for your audience, because it's a very interesting situation before the court. Radovana Karadžića was acquitted on the issue of whether or not there was genocide in the 6 municipalities of the northern Bosnian area in 1992. When your audience will remember, there was certainly a very substantial ethnic cleansing campaign that took place there, and they were convicted under crimes against humanity for that ethnic cleansing campaign. Both men were. But the issue is, was that also genocide? And the interesting argument that the prosecution put forward, and which they have appealed on now with Mladić, which is why this is such an interesting point, is that typically we think of ethnic cleansing being sort of the initial step that ultimately might result in genocide. The prosecution flipped that argument and said that actually it was genocidal acts with intent that launched the ethnic cleansing campaign. You see, it's a flipped argument, but it's a very, very powerful argument. And at the trial chamber level against Mladić, the majority of the judges, only one dissenting, the majority of the judges decided that, yes, there were genocidal acts in the municipalities in 1992, and there was this specific intent to commit those genocidal acts by the perpetrators on the ground. And remember, you know, Mladić is in a superior responsibility level under what was called a joint criminal enterprise. So he will be associated with those actions and that intent under that command structure. Now, the interesting thing is that the trial chamber, however, ruled that the number of Bosnian Muslims hit by this campaign, hit by these genocidal acts in 1992, did not frame a substantial part of the Bosnian Muslim, the Bosniak population. You have to have a substantial hit, not just an occasional hit. Well, I mean, that's a factual issue. And I really do expect the appeals judges to take those facts on and determine whether or not the trial chamber accurately determined the issue of substantial amount in the 1992 actions. Now, to answer the final part of your question, which is very important, let's assume for a moment that the appeals chamber actually convicts Ratku Mladić on count number 1, genocide in the 6 municipalities in 1992. I'm sure that they'll uphold count number 2 on Srebrenica, just like the trial chamber convicted him on genocide in Srebrenica. But the issue is 1992. If that judgment comes down, affirming genocide in 1992 on the part of Ratku Mladić, that opens up the whole issue of the older case before the International Court of Justice, which is Bosnia v. Serbia, in which the International Court of Justice did find that there were genocidal acts in 1992, but they couldn't find the specific intent. They found it easily with Srebrenica because they said, hey, guess what? Mr. Karadžić has been convicted on specific intent, as have others on the Bosnian Serb side. Therefore, we've paired the two together, and ergo, Serbia, should have, under the Convention on Genocide, taken steps to prevent and punish. So, or at least to prevent. And so, if this decision is finding genocide, it opens up the possibility of Bosnia returning to the International Court of Justice with a new case in order to establish the culpability of the Serbian government at that time in 1992 of complicity in the genocide of 1992. Now, of course, you'd need the government in Sarajevo to approve such a submission, and that would be very difficult to obtain with your tripartite, government. But I'm just saying that in theory, it would be there.
The other element here is the case of Stanišić and Simatović. If ever the final judgment is rendered in that case, that would also include Serbia and would have an impact on Serbia's role in what has happened here, and that is also related to Karadžić and Mladić. Do you expect that ever will see the end of that case?
Oh, I would definitely say, as an optimist, that there will be an end to that case, Esmer. Yes, there will not be a perpetual case against those two individuals. But you're absolutely right that if they are found guilty, then that directly implicates Serbia as a complicit party in the struggle, at least with respect to the activities which are part of the counts in that case. And that case has a lot of ethnic cleansing as part of that case. And I think it would be an interesting vindication, quite frankly, because a lot of us had difficulties with where the appeals chamber came out in the Perisic case, and we took heart in how that the finding in the Perisic case, which if the trial chamber had been upheld by the appeals chamber, would have been a direct implication of the Serbian government. But if the appeals chamber can come through and convict these two men, then it not only raises again the complicity issue, with respect to the Serbian government. But it could have, I haven't really thought this through, but it could have an impact on, if there's a Mladić conviction on count 1 genocide in the municipalities in 1992, that can trigger interest in a complicity argument against Serbia at the level of state to state, which is what the International Court of Justice, looks at. And this Simatović decision and Stanišić, that would fortify that kind of analysis that one would take to the International Court of Justice, if one could ever get back there.
Yeah. Radovana Karadžića was just sent to United Kingdom to be to spend the rest of his life to serve the sentence there. When I spoke with Justice Goldson, he told me that he believes that United Kingdom was the only country to offer a place to Radovana Karadžića to serve the remainder of his sentence. But many here in the Balkans say that he was sent there to be punished because he will be far away from his family. You know how the international community works. You're the one of the founders of ICT. Why? Is there any credibility in those claims?
Well, I really doubt that. I worked with the British throughout the 1990s on the Yugoslav Tribunal when I was on deck as ambassador. And I mean, they were my ally, in establishing this. And quite frankly, I don't think the distance issue is a very relevant one. I mean, I'll just say, if I were a judge, I would not consider distance as the primary premise for where one is incarcerated, because you want to look at many other issues of security, of the integrity of the government, which is incarcerating the individual, of the prison system in that government, in that country. And so that, I don't give much credence to that. I have to say that I fought, a losing battle in the United States government, that we should make our prison system, or particularly our high max federal prisons where you just cannot escape from, available to the Yugoslav Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal to take in those who are some of the convicted to serve out their sentences. I lost that battle, but the fact that the United Kingdom volunteered to do so, I think, is just fine. I mean, bear in mind that in the United Kingdom, I do know that they more or less keep the doors locked. Whereas I heard very interesting stories, which I think they're kind of interesting to hear, of certain prosecutors and investigators of the Yugoslav Tribunal. They have to interview some of these individuals again with respect to other cases that are coming before the court. And I'll never forget, one prosecutor saying, "Yeah, I traveled to one of the Nordic countries where, this convicted individual was incarcerated, and of course the Nordics have very generously, come forward to provide." Very
open, and
they're very open. He said, "I drove up, and I don't know, there was no real fence, and he was sitting at a picnic table waiting for me near the forest." And so, I just, it's, every country has a different prison system.
You said that you lost the many battles in this case. You fought to organize the court. I spoke with, I'm going back to Justice Goldson. He says that his help was that he came with support of Nelson Mandela. How much support you had from President Clinton at that time, and Mr. Holbrooke, but also future Secretary of State and Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, when you did your work on war crimes and ICTY?
Well, first and foremost, I had 100% support from, at that time, our ambassador to the UN, Madeleine Albright, and then in the second term of Clinton, she became Secretary of State, and I worked for her for the entire 8 years. And her support was invaluable. She delegated the work to me on war crimes. She came in when I needed her. She addressed the issue whenever that was needed to be done. She helped me bring the resources of the US government together in order to provide staff for the Yugoslav Tribunal in the very early years, and also to diplomatically help with bringing other governments in as supporters of the tribunal, and to make the case year after year for those first 4 years before the UN Security Council. And so, you know, she goes down in history as she made a huge difference because she was in a very high leadership position to make that difference, to make those decisions every day. And I was directly reporting to her, not to anyone else in the department, but to her, both as her senior advisor in the first 4 years, and then as ambassador at large in the second 4 years. So that was a bonding that worked. As for President Clinton, yes, he was there, you know, supporting us. And, you know, I can't dream up right now any instance where I would say he was not more or less fully supportive. Of course, he had a lot of other things to do, but I never saw him as an obstacle to achieving these ends. And that includes during those very tense days leading up to Dayton and through Dayton and after Dayton, in terms of how one would approach the capture of the indicted, you know, fugitives, or what their participation might be in the Dayton talks. And he held quite firm on those issues. I spell all of this out, by the way, for your audience, if you're interested. My last book is entitled The Sit Room. It was published in 2019. And it's all about the deliberations on the Bosnian conflict in the Situation Room of the White House, because I was a deputy on the National Security Council. And it's 4 years of how we got from, you know, January 20th, 1993 to the end of 1995 with the Dayton Accords. And you'll see there where both Albright and Clinton intervene at times within those deliberations. So I think that would be an extremely interesting account for a Bosnian audience. Unfortunately, it hasn't been translated, but it is in English.
Ambassador, how much support or obstacles you had from leaders here in the Western Balkans in those years, especially in these two cases? You wrote that Serbia was a big obstacle when it comes to Karadžić and Mladić, but what was the case with other leaders in the Balkans?
Well, that's a very, very complex question, Esmir, because every leader, my goodness, I have a story about so many different leaders. It's very hard to generalize in responding to your question. I mean, even Mr. Izetbegović, you know, we had very difficult days with him sometimes because, and I don't fault him for it. He was, you know, defending the integrity of the Bosniak population, particularly in the negotiations in 1995, and also, for example, in you know, preserving Gorazde as part of the federation, and in the final negotiations. And I think Gorazde can really credit him for standing tough for the fate of Gorazde. But there were so many others. I mean, the whole relationship with Milosevic was like a roller coaster, you know. And as my book describes, you know, you're constantly putting positions in front of Milosevic to edge him towards his own control, if not manipulation, of the Bosnian Serb leaders. there wasn't much love lost between Milosevic and Karadžić and Mladić, believe me. But you know, well, let me just kind of leave it there. It's a big question, and I would just say that every leader that we dealt with, you know, in addition to Karadžić and Mladić and all of their peculiarities, is a fascinating, almost psychological study that I'm not qualified to comment on, but I would just say that there were very, very difficult moments with many of them, and but also some very courageous moments on the part of many of them.
Ambassador, Tribunal is closing its work with these cases, and you started its work and founded with others. Now, 25 years after that, did ICTY succeed in its role to fulfill justice and to deliver justice to the victims in the Western Balkans? And should we expect to see more tribunals like this formed in the world to fight the issues like this, because we know that atrocities are still happening?
Right. Well, I do think that the ICTY was definitely worth building. They brought, you know, 90 individuals to conviction. They indicted, oh gosh, a total of about 161 individuals. They established a historical record of the atrocities of the Bosnian conflict, which also, of course, included Croatia, in a way that never would have been achieved without the establishment of that court. I mean, historians will be able to look back at the trial records, the briefs, the evidence that was presented for, you know, hundreds of years, quite frankly. And that's a huge educational lift for the region. I also think it's somewhat successful in that, although the whole issue of the governmental composition of Bosnia and Herzegovina remains extremely fraught with tension between the Federation and Republic Srpska, which one can blame Dayton for. I mean, that's a whole debate we could have. The fact is that there has been no war in the region, other than Kosovo, of course, at some distance from Bosnia and Herzegovina, since the tribunal was established in the middle of the Bosnian conflict, which itself was a rather daring thing to do, because typically you think of the tribunals being established after the end of the war. We did it, you know, 4 years before the war ended, or a little less than 4 years. So it demonstrates that, yes, actually you can make an empirical case that building a tribunal like this can be a deterrent to further atrocities in the future. And that's being borne out empirically in other parts of the world, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, etc., where we built tribunals. Now, in the future, there will have to be a combination. The atrocities are not abating. I mean, you know, within the last few months, look what happened to the Tigray people in Ethiopia. Total ethnic cleansing, mass rapes. Look what's happening on genocide with the Uyghurs in China. So this is going to continue. And the International Criminal Court, which I also had a fair amount to do with, it's not going to be able to cover everything. We know that because of jurisdictional limitations. And so the building of ad hoc tribunals will have to continue, but the Security Council will probably not be the body that does it. Remember, the Security Council approved the building of the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, and that meant that UN assessments were paid to help finance it. Rather, they're going to have to be the types of courts that we saw built for Sierra Leone, for Cambodia, for Lebanon, where, and even Kosovo, where there's a voluntary funding basis and negotiations on bilateral treaties between an organization and a government are undertaken. All of that can be very, very complex. And yet, when you look at Syria as a prime example of a place that must see justice someday, the whole idea of how to build a tribunal to deal with Syria occupies a lot of the time of people like myself and others, particularly in academia, who keep looking at this. And by the way, one final point, Esmir, people should take note of the profusion of investigative mechanisms that have been approved by the United Nations, by the UN Human Rights Council, et cetera, because that's step number one to ultimately getting to a tribunal. And there has been receptivity in the UN system, in the General Assembly in particular, to building investigative mechanisms so as to bring all of the evidence possible together as a setup for the possibility of prosecutorial adjudication in the future. And I would finally end by going back to the Yugoslav Tribunal and reminding the audience that it was built as a leadership accountability tribunal. In other words, only really to go after the leadership rank or the most egregious, perpetrator rank in the conflict, and indicting as many people as it did, convicting 90 of them, acquitting some of them, is a demonstration of doing that. But of course, the war crimes chamber in Sarajevo is the ongoing process to go to lower levels, and that continues to be extremely important.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so very much for your time and for this interview.
Thank you very much, Esmir. It's been my joy. Thanks.
Poštovani gledalci, ovo je razgovor sa profesorom Davidom Schefferom. Razgovarali smo o presudi Ratku Mladiću, o Radovanu Karadžiću, ratnim zločinima, ali i američkoj politici i uspostavljanju Haškog tribunala. Ostanite uz program N1. Doviđenja.